Hey Northview, it's Lexi. Thank you for joining us for episode 3 of In Good Company. Today we will be discussing one of your questions regarding when it's okay to disobey the government. Now let's hear from our pastors Josh, Jesse, and Greg.
Thanks so much for joining us again. We're glad you're here for our 3rd episode of In Good Company. We've really enjoyed these conversations, and we've actually enjoyed how you guys have joined us in the conversation. Since before our first episode came out, you guys have been sending us emails of questions and ideas, things you want us to talk about, because you want to talk about them too. So we're excited this episode to have a conversation around a few emails that we've had around the same subject. And it's important because I've been having these conversations with friends, with family, even among staff. This has been a pretty important conversation right now in the time that we're in. So I want to, Lexi, if you could pull up this email. For those of you who don't know, Lexi is on set. She's our producer. She's going to pull up an email. So this was sent in to us by Debbie. Debbie writes this: Hi, thanks for the work you are all doing in finding new ways of reaching out to communicate with us all during this time. Really appreciated. We just left that in there because we appreciate that you appreciated that.
And that was nice. Thanks, Debbie.
I have a few questions. This one you can blame on Pastor Mark, this last Sunday service.
Yeah.
So, when is it okay to disobey the government, especially when considering the millions of innocent babies being killed each year, assisted suicides, etc.? Do we just stand silently by and allow it to happen? It's a pretty big question. So actually, I want to turn it over to a clip from Pastor Mark's sermon. This was a few weeks back. He was preaching on Esther chapter 3. So we're just going to take a 30-second clip and watch it together.
What if the government made laws that violate our biblical values of right and wrong? What if our government one day would redefine marriage and sexuality? What if on a more mundane level, the government would say churches can no longer meet, close them all down? Liquor stores and cannabis stores are essential services, but the church is not essential. What if something like that happened? When is civil disobedience justified?
So that's the can of worms that Pastor Mark opened for us. And we're here to clean up the mess. I want to read a couple of passages from Scripture that Mark actually refers to in his sermon because they're pretty foundational for our understanding of the relationship between the church and the government. So I'm going to start in Romans 13, verses 1 to 5. Is what it says: Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. Those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So there, Paul is pretty clear that we as Christians ought to be in subjection to the governing authorities. And he says the reason why is because God puts them there. And so in some sense, our obedience to the governing authorities is related to our obedience to God because he put them there. But to flip on the other side of the conversation, Mark also referenced Acts chapter 5, verse 29. A little bit of context: the apostles, Peter and the apostles, have been preaching the gospel, and the council and the high priest bring them before them and say, you're not allowed to preach this gospel anymore, stop it. But they go out and they carry on and they preach it again. And so in Acts 5:29, Peter responds to their accusation that you stopped, you disobeyed us and you preached the gospel. And he says this in Acts 5:29, but Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. So there, Peter himself is clear that our final obedience is to God over men. How does that interact with our submission to governing authorities? That's the question, and that's a big question. So the first question we got from Debbie, I want to break it up into 2 pieces. And so the first piece, let's start with the basis of the conversation. When is it appropriate? When is it actually right for a Christian to disobey the government? And so I want to toss it to you guys. What do you think? First thoughts, when is it okay for a Christian to disobey the government?
Yeah. No, that's good. I mean, my first take, is that okay if I speak first, Jesse?
Yes, you have permission.
I already did.
You have permission,
Thank you.
yeah.
I don't know where I read it, but it's a little mantra that I think has been helpful, that we
You're a big mantra guy.
I'm a big mantra guy. We live as good citizens until acting as a good citizen would make us a bad Christian.
That's
So
good.
until we obey everywhere and all the places that we can, unless to obey the government would be to disobey God.
So
And
Acts 5 is a good example.
So Acts 5 is a great
Right.
example of had they continued in their obedience to the governing authorities at the time,
Yeah.
they would have actually been disobedient to God. And so they decided in that instance to actually not listen to the authorities that were over them at that time, the Sanhedrin, which would have had probably some governmental authority kind of given to them by the Roman occupation. But
If it's making us a bad Christian, that is the only time where we should, as Christians, disobey our governing authorities.
that'd be my argument. 'Cause I think to make it looser than that, I think just gets us in the realm of subjectivity and into
Yeah.
my likes and my preferences. Do you disagree? Do you ask the question because you disagree, or you just want
Well, I
me to
don't
say
like
that
agreeing with
Do
you,
you-
but yes, I think you're right.
you want me to say that I
Unfortunately.
think I'm right? That's
Yes,
what you want me to do?
Yeah. Take a stand, you wuss. Come on.
So if we were to make a line, like we're saying when it makes you a bad Christian, could we define that line as sin? Could we just say
Sure.
it that
Yep.
way? When the government mandates, when what the government legislates actually calls me to sin,
Yeah.
I will disobey.
Yes.
It's at the line of sin.
And
Yeah.
I'd like to nuance it a little bit in just
Yeah.
saying if it's causing you to sin, but also if it's keeping you from doing what Christ has commanded.
Right.
So
That's
if
good.
there was a law that didn't allow me to love my neighbor or something, I like not loving my neighbor to the full extent maybe is sin, maybe it's not. I don't know. We can debate that. But there are things we've commanded to do, like preach the gospel.
Right.
And not preaching the gospel in every instance. Again, is that sin? Is it not sin? But if we're not allowed to do it, then
Totally.
so I just maybe would nuance that a little.
So let me spice that piece up a little bit in the current context that we're in right now.
Make
Yeah.
it spicy.
Make
That's
it
right.
spicy.
Little bit of
hot.
cumin.
Little Frank's Red Hot.
Little Frank's Red Hot.
Okay, good.
So in our current situation, a lot of people will turn to Hebrews chapter 10.
Yeah.
Right. Do not forsake meeting together.
Yeah.
As some are in the habit of
Yeah.
doing. So that's a clear verse.
Yeah.
Don't forsake meeting together. And yet now we're in a time when the government has called us to not meet together. And now there's some provision for it to happen in groups of 50.
Yeah.
But before that, it was pretty much all shut down. Were we in disobedience to the Word of God when we stopped gathering? Because it says don't forsake meeting, but the government said we need to stop for a while.
In British Columbia, I don't ever think we got to the point where they made gatherings of any number illegal. I think other states and provinces may have gone there,
Yeah.
but I think in BC in particular, they kind of weaved a line there. They walked a tightrope in that we all thought that's what they said,
Yeah.
but it wasn't actually, I don't think, a mandate at that time. And so, but even if it had been,
Yeah.
I think there are Christians who have made the case that, look, in order for the love of neighbor,
Yeah.
this short-term decision needs to be made, not only because it's government mandated, but also because it's the most loving thing we could do for the other, for the neighbor. In the early days of the pandemic, that
Yeah.
was the exact rationale. I remember staying in the room with you guys
Right.
and others when we were making this decision.
Yeah.
And the mandate, the decision behind closing our services
Yeah.
was not because the government told us to. Actually, when we made the decision was before there was any announcements about restrictions in everyday life. But the thing that motivated us was love of neighbor.
Yeah.
That if we had a gathering of thousands, and if this virus was a part of that gathering, we would have been a part of a huge cluster that would have exponentially increased the cases in BC,
Yeah.
or could have
Right.
Yeah.
exponentially
Yeah.
increased. And so I think in that case, I also think in the Hebrews passage, it's not necessarily trying to address, mass gatherings of churches.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think the heart behind the passage is the spurring on of one another. It's,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
the edifying the other. It's the helping each
100%.
other persevere. And so
Yeah.
to read that just purely flatly in every circumstance,
Yeah.
I don't think is actually the best reading of the passage.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, that's a really good point because you look at the passage and what he's trying to get at. Do not forsake meeting together as some are in the habit of doing.
Yeah.
He's actually speaking to a discipleship problem that there were some who had the ability to gather
Yeah.
and were forsaking it for other reasons.
Yeah.
And because they were forsaking it, they were devaluing what was the good gathering and fellowship of Christians.
Yeah.
He wasn't thinking mass gatherings. We have a tendency of reading our own context into the Bible. When we think gathering, we think Sunday morning, 1,000 people showing up for a service. But that's not what he was saying. The church gathering was in homes. It was a few people. It was tens, right?
Yeah. So I think we've settled, though, on when it's okay to disobey.
Yeah.
And it's when the government would be telling us you have to sin.
That's right.
Or when we're somehow restricted from doing what Christ has commanded us to do.
I also think in particular, maybe another like nuance to that is that if the government was to single out Christians amongst other categories of people. So for example, if the 50-person gathering limit was only placed on Christians, but other faiths or other businesses or other organizations were able to gather, then in my mind, that's a special kind of persecution. And that's actually how I
But that
understand
kind of happened,
persecution.
right? So Costco could have more than 50 people in their parking lot and such, and yet as a church, we still can't. So that kind of is happening. Is that a good example of that or no?
Well, that's where I think Debbie, or it was Mark, I think, who brought up that essential, non-essential distinction, right? And so an arbitrary distinction, right? And in some senses, but yeah, I think in the context of, even if we were to play that out, the kind of gathering that takes place in a Costco, in terms of, just walking past people maybe once, maybe twice in your entire visit, once you're actually in the store, is very different than sitting in a room full of other people for 60 to 75 minutes. So the environment was different, and the issue with the 50 people has almost always been communicated as a gathering kind of setting, right? So
totally.
restaurants, movie theaters, these kinds of places where it's not just me walking by someone, it's actually us sitting for a while, like this kind of setup.
That's right. Yeah. So I think we're pretty settled, what you're saying. I think we're pretty settled on saying when the government mandates us to sin, we will not. We will disobey our government. But let me bring us to the second question, which is a little more gray. So both Mark and Debbie have brought up the example of abortion. What do we do in a situation where the government is not mandating sin, but is permitting sin? So the government hasn't come to me and said, Joshua, you need to abort your children. But it has come to me and said, Joshua, if you want to, you can. It hasn't come to me and said, Joshua, you need to enter a gay marriage. But they've said, if you want to, you can. So what is a Christian response to the government making something permissible, which we know to be sinful, but they haven't mandated it upon us? How do we respond to that?
I think first, I would say, is the way Mark emphasized it was, when do we disobey? And I think we need to be careful. There's a distinction between disagreeing and disobeying. Like we live in a different society than when Scripture was written. For example, when Romans 13 was written, and the society is a democratic one. And so we are allowed and encouraged to disagree, and we exercise that in various ways, whether it's petitioning or protesting or voting or all these different things. And so as Christians, the question isn't whether or not we agree with the law, but now we need to go to the question, okay, so when we disagree, what do we do? And I think I think that's an important distinction first.
Yeah, I know. But that is really good. And to hop on your comment there about we're living in a democratic society. When you look at the New Testament, and the idea of the Christian church vying for political reform is kind of alien. It doesn't show up anywhere. Because they had a mission. Their mission was preaching the gospel. But they lived within a society that was governed by an emperor, right? And so that their ability for political reform was near nothing. They what would they do? Go talk to the emperor and say, "Hey, can you change this? I don't really like it." But now we live in a society
That would not
go well. You wouldn't come back. Now we live in a democratic society. Our voice holds weight, and so as the Christian church, we live in a very different world than the New Testament world. And so us speaking up can have an impact and actually should have an impact, where back then it didn't.
And I would even add on to that individual Christians, as their ability and as their opportunity to do so, should engage in those processes in greater and lesser degrees. So for example, if there's a Christian who feels a call to serve in public service as an MLA, as a member of parliament, that Christian should pursue that good vocation where they can live as a Christ follower in that place, And they should, in that place, live out the ethics and the behaviors and the beliefs of Jesus.
Yeah.
And we as citizens should engage in our acts of the things available to us, voting and petitions, that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
with the Christian mindset. So I think living in this kind of a context politically is an advantage to not just Christians, but all peoples of faith, where we can actually be a part of the authority structure,
Right.
Yeah.
when we're being voted in. And so I actually think Romans 13 is a good encouragement, not only for us as citizens to obey unless we're being forced to sin,
Yeah.
but also to be an encouragement for people who feel that instinctual call to participate in
Yeah.
things like being a city councilor, being an MLA, being
Yeah.
a member of parliament, because we need people in those places to help our land be more just and
Right.
more
Yeah.
righteous and all that kind of good stuff that we're desperate for.
Yeah. We are saying that we should and probably are called to disagree really well with our governing authorities because especially the democratic society that we live in, that is an opportunity that is maybe a common grace given to the church to say, hey, we can speak into society, have our voice heard, we need to disagree well. Disagreeing well, though, in a democratic society is not disobedience. So we're not there yet. We haven't crossed that line yet. So when should we cross that line, I think is the next question. And I think of an example, the civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King stepped into disobedience. He was imprisoned several times throughout that time. I don't think any of us here are going to argue, unless good luck with that, saying that was he should not have done that or whatever, right? So what are some examples? What are some, I don't know, maybe principles or texts that would drive us to know when we would disobey, when our disagreeing is simply not enough?
Right. So my first take would be that I think what the civil rights movement essentially does is engaging in the laws of the land, which are forcing actions against what God's laws would permit, or what God's laws would what God would have us do, how He would have us act. And so it's an act of both disagreement and disobedience.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think the nuance to that in our context is that there are things like the abortion conversation where that's not opposed upon people.
Yeah.
It's a unjust, ungodly thing that we should try to work towards seeing it not be a part of our society. But that is a different kind of thing than a structure being opposed on a people which is ungodly.
Right.
Yeah.
And being a mandated experience.
So
for
you're
people.
saying that essentially permitting people to sin is the civil rights movement is not a good example in a sense of they're not apples to apples in a sense.
I don't think they are.
Well, yeah.
Well, but if I would push on that,
Yeah.
you're talking about something being imposed on somebody that we
Yes.
know is unjust and unlawful. Well, the reason that we oppose abortion is because we're convinced that the person in that womb is a person.
Totally
And so
agree.
there's the being imposed on them, that their rights are being taken away as a human being.
Yes.
So I do actually feel like there's some apples to apples in that scenario.
Yeah. All I'm arguing is that I don't actually think to fight against abortion laws is civil disobedience.
Oh, I get you. Yes.
I'm saying that we are trying
Got
to
it.
engage in the civil structures to bring about more godliness in our laws.
Yes. Totally.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the comparison is different.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's an important note to make here about laws and the goodness of laws. Like we as the Christian church, we see laws in a nation rightfully and hopefully as an extension of God's very character. They're an extension of His desire for society, for human flourishing. And so when we see laws go astray, and they start to impose or legislate things that are not for human flourishing, that are against God's very character, and therefore will do harm to our human neighbors, or the neighbors we love, then that's why this is an important thing. That's why it's not just that I want justice for my Christian brothers. I want justice for all of humanity because God's love, God's laws are His extension of His character and will bring human flourishing.
Yeah.
And so they're actually, I think, we need to be able to say there is an importance to the Christian voice speaking up against these kind of lawless things, or the exact things that we're talking about.
But Will, so here's a maybe provocative question. will the Christianization of our legislation system actually lead to human flourishing? So is there flourishing apart from Christ, is what I'm asking.
Right. I think what the structures would give us is the best shot of mitigating evils
Yes.
and promoting goods. But if we believe that through legislative acts, we
Yeah.
are actually in any sense bringing about the eschaton, bringing about the
eschaton, what does that
reign
even
the reign
mean?
and rule of
Yeah,
Christ
right.
forever and ever,
Yeah.
eternal, and
Yeah.
every we can't forget that the issue isn't primarily
Right.
that people don't follow laws.
Yeah.
People don't follow laws because they are inherently sinful.
Yeah.
And so only when all things are made new
Yeah.
will the perfect government finally exist. Will the perfect societal flourishing
Yes.
exist? And that's why I think it's so crucial for our understanding of eternity and of
Yes.
heaven to not be a disembodiment from the things we know to be true, but the perfection of the things we know to be true.
Yeah.
So it's the perfection of our governing systems, of
Yeah.
our sports, of our arts,
Yeah.
rather than a removal of it and a disembodiment experience. So it's that tension
Right.
of trying to work towards things that will look more like that,
Right.
Yeah.
while knowing
Yes.
we won't ever be able to fully finally achieve it because that's ultimately God's work.
Yes.
Right.
And there exists a danger, I think, in if we put our hope in legislative change or trying to legislate morality, if we put our hope in that, we got to sit back and recognize how every law made by a human is imperfect. And so even, okay, the system of capitalism, that's God's, wait a minute, that's like fuels greed. What about no-fault divorce? Like, we got to start marching about that now. Like, where do we stop with all of these laws in our society that would be contrary to what God has called his people to? And so there just is a limit to the way. And so I hope that would never lead us to diminish our need to bring about reform through the gospel of Jesus Christ and through his church.
So maybe like a little illustration here, you guys can let me know if you think this works. So let's imagine that I go into the ER with a broken leg, and I'm
Feel
in
free,
there,
brother.
and I'm in a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And there's a nurse there who gives me some pain medicine to help alleviate my temporary pain.
Yeah.
But I know that I actually need my broken leg to be reset
Yeah.
and put in a cast for it to actually heal.
Yeah.
So we know that all of the things that we do before the return of Christ
Yeah.
are bringing pain medication
Yeah.
to the broken leg. But we also know that the leg actually needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
And so we wouldn't say, you know what's not a noble endeavor?
Yeah.
Giving the person in the ER room the pain medication. We would say, no, you totally should.
Yeah.
Like you should use
Yeah.
the best pain medication you can, and you should give it to them swiftly.
Yeah.
But we also know
Yeah.
that pain medication is going to wear off. And if
Yes.
the leg isn't actually reset, it's not going to get better.
Yeah.
And so that might help us think through,
Yes.
in a societal sense, our laws and the things we strive for are the Band-Aids and the pain medications that are good things to give to a society, but the
Yeah.
society won't actually be fundamentally restructured to be perfected until Christ returns.
Yeah.
So noble,
Yes.
good, pursue it,
Yeah.
but it's not actually going to deliver in a final sense what's needed in the
Right, right.
situation.
So to come back to our question, what we're saying, I think, across the board is yes, there is room, and we should, as Christians, speak up against things that legislate sinful activity.
Yeah.
But knowing that it's not going to be the final end. There is a deeper wound that needs to be healed, and
Yeah.
that the only way that wound will be healed is through the gospel of Christ. Well, Christ Himself, right?
Yeah, I think it's a both and for
Right.
sure.
Yeah.
But I also would weight our Christian sense of duty stronger in the gospel proclamation
Yes.
end.
Yeah,
Whereas
absolutely.
I would say that it is good for Christians vocationally to be involved in things that will bring societal reform. That's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
But I think that all Christians are called to the disciple-making activity of helping the gospel go forth, regardless of if they're involved in, if they're a member of parliament
Yeah.
or they're a chef at Wendy's.
Yeah.
Are they called chefs?
That was big. That's big.
They
yeah.
make the menu at the head Wendy's. Regardless of what your vocation is, you have a calling as a Christian to help address the deeper wound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's, in some way, we actually should think that there is a triage to Christian behavior.
Yeah.
There are activities of the Christian life that are more important that are more critical to being a Christian than other activities. So proclamation of the gospel being one.
Yeah.
Okay, there's probably still muddy water there that we could wander
we
through.
cleared
But
that up.
I want to bring it to we cleared it right up. I want to bring it to a third question,
You
and
can
this
drink
kind of
that
maybe
one.
bring a short question here. Dave sent us an email as well, and so I want to read it. Lexi already pulled it up. Thank you, Lexi. And let me read this. It puts a different nuance to this question. So here's what he writes. Hello, Scripture clearly says that we must obey those in authority. That's the Romans 13 we've already read. However, should it be the church's responsibility to push back on what appears to be government overreach during this pandemic? In other words, how should we speak out while at the same time honoring those in authority?
That's a great question.
It's a great question. So it nuances it even further. So now we're past what the government has allowed, has permitted us to sin, but not mandating. Now it's when the government makes a rule or puts in an order that reaches into our freedom as Christians a little bit. For instance, gathering, right? This is where we are right now. It's our freedom as Canadians, but also as Christians, is to be able to gather and worship as people of faith. But the government has reached into that a little bit because of a global pandemic and said, actually, let's put that on hold. We've kind of touched this a little bit in our first discussion.
Yeah.
But let's reach into that nuance a smidgen. Where is it appropriate for the church to push back in the disagreement, to push back on government orders that reach into our freedoms a little bit?
My first take, which I think this is going to be the part of the conversation where we both get the most head nodding and also the most like fist shaking at how we process this issue.
That's right.
I think that again, I think we would have to look at, are Christians being treated unfairly, or and by that what I mean is, are we being singled out and being asked to do things that other groups aren't being asked to do? Are they treating us differently in that sense? And that's where I have a hard time thinking that, again, we could disagree with the government's take on how they've handled the situation from the beginning. You could be the kind of person who thinks that from the very beginning of the pandemic until the pandemic is fully over, that the government made the wrong call every single time. But I still don't think you could say that they treated us, at least at this point of when we're recording, that they've treated us any different than anyone else. So you could disagree with how the government's gone about it, but I don't know what we would hold on to fight back. Because at this point, the government has never actually prohibited us from gathering.
So let me give something to hold on to so we can fight back.
Okay.
So let's say that because of these restrictions, because of this overreach, quote unquote, that has caused a significant mental health crisis in our society. That maybe suicide rates are higher. There's domestic violence going on. As Christians, even this is causing a lot of people to fall away from their faith. So this idea of having a faith that perseveres is important. One of the gifts, the graces, the Hebrews passage is gathering and worshiping together. So what if this overreach is causing mental health? Is causing more domestic violence to happen and marriages to break down, and is causing people to lose their faith and lose their trust in God. At some point, are those not noble enough to say, you know what, this overreach needs to stop, and we as a church need to gather for the sake of the perseverance of the saints and so on and so forth? Is that a good reason to disobey?
That adds something to it. But if I were to, I think we have to admit that there's a lot of factors. We have to admit that there's more than simply, in this particular case, there's more than simply obedience to the government and disagreeing with the government. There are reasons why we could look and say, okay, there's some validity to the actions of the government, and there are lots of people who agree with that, who think the government has done the right thing. But there are other people who think, wow, there's not. It's not valid. And if we were to peel away, say if we went to the nth degree, where the government in the middle of no pandemic, say nothing was actually happening, but the government said there's a pandemic, you all need to stop gathering. And we look and say there's absolutely no evidence. And you're saying we need to stop gathering. You're not bringing anything scientific to the table. Then I think we would probably be sitting in this chair probably saying we should still gather. There's no evidence. The problem is there is evidence. And so there's factors that make this a little more difficult, that even make it difficult in the nuance of saying that there is a mental health crisis. There are these things happening. And yet there is science and scientific data that back up the reasons that the government is making. Even if we disagree with the science, it's there, it exists. So there's a lot of factors. And this is where, even from our leaders, our elders. This is where wisdom in the Christian is so critical, because there will always be gray areas where something like this happens and it's not clear. It's not a clear cut obey, disobey, gather, don't gather. There's a little bit of muddy water, and you need to wander through it a little bit.
Let me put a label on you for a second, okay?
Label
Ready?
me.
Here we
Label
go.
me. I've already
I
been
hear
labeled.
you saying there needs to be an extremely compelling reason, set of data in order for us to take that step of civil disobedience. So you're saying even if there's a kind of a mental health crisis going on, even if people are losing their faith, if there is a sliver of wisdom and discernment coming from the civil authorities of why they did the thing they did, we have the posture of submitting to that versus finding different evidences to the contrary. Would you be?
I would say that
that's
if
a posture in a sense.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think the general posture of the church should be that when we come to a text like Romans 13 or 1 Peter 2, he says, honor the government, honor the authorities. Even there, he says, honor the emperor. And the emperor was certainly not doing kind things to Christians when he wrote that.
Fact.
Right? So to say that the posture of the church needs to begin with, I will honor the government. I will submit to the government. But if I am given evidence that makes it clear to me that in doing so, or they are reaching in and they are destroying my freedom, or I'm being disobedient to God, that's when I would cross the line.
I do think it's helpful for us to realize that in our context, in British Columbia, our government isn't actually telling us we can't gather. Our government is actually saying you can gather, just make sure you're doing it safely.
Right.
So in our context for Northview, we want to, because we know that mental health is an issue, because we know that people need outlets, people need to gather to be encouraged in the faith. We want to encourage you to try to find ways that are still safe with all the COVID measures in place to gather with other believers. So we're going to try to do that in groups of 50 at our Downs Road campus and our Mission campus that you guys can register for if you want to be a part of that. We're also just going to try to encourage all of us as believers who go to Northview to have over a family or two families or some friends of yours, if whoever might be around you, some neighbors, just engage in doing the Christian life with others. Have the Sunday morning service activity as something you do with others. And so this is something I think we can do while obeying the government and also faithfully living out what Christ calls us to do. We can do it. It's just for the next foreseeable future, it's just going to look different than what it did a few months ago.
Yeah,
That's good.
Sure. This is a tough topic to find full-blown consensus
that's
on.
right.
And I think there's been Christians throughout the ages that have fallen on different sides of the spectrum in terms of how we engage. But to close our conversation, I thought I'd read from the book of 1 Peter. Here's what the author writes. He says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." Goes on to say, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor." Thanks for joining us on this episode of Good Company. Hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to hear your comments or thoughts on today's episode, or any suggestions and ideas that you'd like us to cover in our future episodes. You can send those in to ingoodcompany@northview.org. See you next week.